to start and to work from then on. And the idea is to regulate the international transfers of mitigation outcomes between both countries, but also, and this is very important, while promoting sustainable development and guaranteeing environmental integrity. I think that's part of what many of the groups that are discussing and that are working on Article 6 and how to move forward on that are highlighting these ideas and these principles that are important and overall for the implementation of the Paris Agreement as well. Obviously, this framework is consistent to the rules of the Paris Agreement, to what is already approved, and it does not prejudge any further negotiations or any further decisions that will be made. That's part of what has also been established and is part of the decisions that both countries have agreed upon to. And obviously, and I think very centrally and part of the heart of this process is that it is part, and it should be part of the national regulations that each country has. Next, please. So some of the elements or the characteristics of the agreement that I think are very important and that both countries and in general, both teams have been discussing during probably a lot of time. First, that it is framed, as I mentioned previously, under the principles of environmental integrity and the transparency of the Paris Agreement, so that's important. Also, I would like to highlight the joint work. There is much that has been done. There's much that has been learned through this process. And I think that is very important because that highlights first the interest of both countries in to move forward into this process and also to support the learning process that comes through the negotiation process. So that's important. And the agreement reflects the deep, diverse, and long discussions, but that both countries have had during the time frame in which this was negotiated. Also, a third element that I would like to highlight is related to it establishes the framework of rules and procedures to recognize international transfer of mitigation outcomes. Definitely, it's important also to highlight in overall that this does not focus on a specific sector, it is overall. So that will be part of the decisions and the procedures that will have to be established by both countries and the assessments that both countries do under the framework of this agreement and in overall under the framework of their NDC process or how does this link or not to the NDC process as well. And either party can transfer or receive this ITMO. So that's important also to highlight because it does not prejudge where or how both countries will be, how they will be part of the agreement or of the further agreements that will be signed for this under this process. And this makes me reflect on the last element that we have identified here that is related that this is not a commercial agreement, it's just a framework for the process, and it's important to highlight it as well. I think I'm in there. Okay, so it's not a commercial agreement, and it establishes the framework. Further agreements will be established in order to address, let's say, the feasibility or not of a commercial agreement. So this is mainly the what I wanted to reflect related to these elements. Next, please. So these are some of the commitments or the elements assumed by both countries. I'm not going to go through them, reading them, because I think that obviously all of us can look at this slide. But I would just like to reflect that commitments that are very important, and I think in overall important in the Article 6 discussions, is that the agreement and both countries commit related to the non-occurrence of double counting. And I think that's important, and that's part of what it has established and the language that has been included in the agreement. So that's something that both countries are committed to. Also, we are committing into establishing a registry, and this is important because it also reflects and links to this principle of avoiding or reducing the possibilities of double counting. Definitely that's important, and that is part of what we have further to work on from each side, from each country. And obviously, this is part of the transparency that we want to highlight in the process of this, not only of negotiating the agreement, but of what's coming forward and next steps related to highlighting the transparency process of this, and that it's going to be included. Obviously, all the information will be included and received in the reports that are submitted to the UNFCCC. And that is part of the transparency process and of the coherence and robustness of these kind of agreements. Next, please. Next. There. So maybe now I would like to go a little bit into what is part of the context of Peru. And mainly, I would like to reflect, especially on that we submitted last December 18th, our updated NDC. As many of you know, this is an economy-wide NDC, and our commitment has gone from 30 to 40% to reduce emissions to 2030. So this also gives us an overall idea of the commitments Peru has under the Paris Agreement and under this process, and definitely this is part of the overarching framework that we have in the country. Also, I would like to comment that definitely there are things that still need to be worked on, but I think that we are doing a very good process, especially in countries with a legal system such as Peru and such as many of Peru's neighbors and Latin American countries. We need to have clarity and establish legal security over this process. And this is something that we have been moving forward and taking big steps on this. First, because we enacted our legal framework, first with the enactment of the climate change law, which was enacted in 2018, at the end of 2018, and its specific regulation in 2019, which establishes the specific mandate of who's going to be able to do what related to the transference of ITMOs and overall of all of these process, also related to Article 6. So that's a mandate that's already embedded in this regulation. It is given to the Ministry of Environment. So that's important because it starts clarifying the overall path and gives clarity not only to the public sector, but also to different stakeholders on who are the actors and who does what. And that's definitely important in countries like Peru that need these regulations and this specific legislation to clarify this process, especially because this is part of what professionals within the public sector can or cannot do. So this is important to clarify. And also it establishes or creates the registry, which is called RENAMI, which is our National Registry for Mitigation Actions. And this is part, obviously, of our MRV systems, which includes other elements or other tools as well. But this is important because the registry is created, it's given the mandate. The Ministry of Environment is in charge of this registry. So those are, I think, fundamental steps to understand how Peru is moving forward in this process, and definitely something that grants or gives legal security to clarify this process in the long term. Next, please. So some of the next steps that we have been identifying and in overall what can be part of the process to implement this agreement are related to establishing, as I mentioned, we have this big framework right now. We have this clarity over the national framework, but still there, as the agreement has mentioned, there are national procedures, and that will follow upon this to establish clarity over the agreement and establish the underpinnings of this process. So we are working on establishing procedures under the framework of this national legislation that I just previously mentioned. These are specific regulations or specific rules and procedures that we need to clarify internally at the national level. So from that, we have a specific mentions from, not of the Article 6, obviously, but overall of these processes and in general from the Constitution to flowing to the national framework I just mentioned. So that needs to flow to specific regulations and specific procedures that we are working right now on. This obviously includes the registry, as well as other regulations that clarify the flow of information, the institutional arrangements that need to be established so that this is clarified and there's a solid and robust process in which any stakeholder can engage, and it's clear what are the procedures, what are the steps that that have to be made, and what are the timings, because many people ask how much time this is going to take at the national level, and then how does this national procedure link to the international procedure with Switzerland. So from us, our first step is focusing on that, on the national procedures, in order to clarify the steps for different stakeholders to engage in this process. This is part of, this also implies disseminating and strengthening capacities at the national level to engage in this process. This is definitely something that we need to promote, and it's part of an ongoing process that the Ministry of Environment has, and is linking obviously this with different sectors that could be included under the agreement. Also, I would like to highlight that we are also assessing possible gaps of information, of procedures. As I mentioned, this is not perfect, so definitely we need to continue assessing the possibility of gaps, but not only gaps related to the policy or the legislation, which I have specifically mentioned, but also gaps related to the operational levels. Sometimes when you start moving the wheel, you start understanding how things can or cannot work. So that definitely is something that we're assessing as part of the process, and also of some of the national circumstances we have in the country. And definitely, as I mentioned, institutional arrangements are definitely important. Sometimes you establish perfect policies, but you forget about the institutional arrangements. So that's definitely something important to address. And also, I would like to highlight the social and environmental safeguards. A country so diverse as Peru needs to address these issues from the beginning. So this is part of what we're doing, and this is probably because this is linked to ensuring sustainable development of the different stakeholders and of different actors that we have in the country, especially in times such as the pandemic. This is quite clear that we need to address this and clarify these processes in order to really bring sustainable development to different stakeholders. I would also like to finalize with some reflections related to this process in overall. First, that the overall process of the negotiation and having this agreement, there's a lot of work behind, and I think Veronica and the team in Switzerland, and also the overall team in Peru that is part of the Ministry of Environment, has worked very hard to move this forward. And I think that there's a principle that we have been that I think is clear, that we are acting instead of reacting. We are discussing. This has given a lot of lessons learned, and a lot of things to continue discussing. And this is important because we are not reacting to something, we are discussing internally, and the times have been very good on that, because it implies that we are really understanding and trying to identify what is needed in a country such as ours. So definitely that is something that it's a takeaway for these issues, definitely what is going to be implied for different stakeholders, that is definitely also something to discuss. As I mentioned, the ultimate goal for us is sustainable development, but with a climate resilient and low carbon emissions path. So that is what moves us forward in this process, and definitely something that we need to continue assessing different ways in which we can promote this process. Also, this process in overall of working on the agreement has helped us design diverse regulations and policies, because we need to continue working on further linking all of our processes so that there's legal security and legal coherence over the overall process. Obviously, there are still decisions that have to be made, but I think that we are working on we're establishing a solid basis, including the enabling conditions necessary to promote this process, and especially what convenes us today, this agreement. And this is important because in many cases, many of our countries, the enabling conditions are the process that take us more time. So that definitely is something that we are engaging right now. And this is, I think, something good for overall for the country. And I think also, and I would like to end my my presentation now with highlighting the importance of dialogue. As I mentioned, social and environmentals are important. The dialogue that we have engaged with is not only important at the international level with our Swiss colleagues, but also at the national level. Dialogue, supporting this process, strengthening capacities or building the capacities necessary in a country so diverse as Peru is definitely of ultimate importance. And I think that is something that we need, that I would like to highlight as part of this process, that this is bringing in a diversity of views and a diversity of opportunities that definitely are important for a country such as Peru. Thank you very much.
Andre, you're on mute.
Thank you. I was very persuasive. But anyway, it was lost. So I have to repeat what I'm saying is that's a million questions that come to my mind. Others probably will have questions. So rather than ask questions now, maybe Veronica, you want to go next, and then we can get into a conversation. So Veronica, you're going to share your own screen, right?
Yes, I can do that. I hope you can see the screen now. So
yes, I can.
Excellent. Thanks very much for the opportunity to share the experiences, from the Peruvian Swiss approach, and particularly also from the Swiss side now for my presentation. Let me just start off very briefly on some background on the Swiss engagement under the Article 6. Certainly, we see Article 6 as an opportunity for enhanced global mitigation action as set out in the Paris Agreement. Switzerland has formulated a nationally determined contribution beyond the effects of its strengthened domestic policies. The overall target is minus 50% by 2030, whereas strengthened domestic policies under the updated national legislation will achieve 3/4 of that target, leaving room and generating cooperation under Article 6. Now, we aim with this to achieve additional mitigation outcomes, contributing to the combating climate change in our partner countries, and that goes together with additional investments and the associated co-benefits in these countries. Needless to say that the means used on the Swiss side to purchase ITMOs are additional to international climate finance. And with this setup, we truly believe from the Swiss side that the use of Article 6 can contribute to enhanced mitigation action. And that is where we're coming from in this journey with Peru, and that is still ahead of us to some extent. Very briefly, Milagros has already elaborated on our bilateral approach to this, just very much in the nutshell here. And I think I also try to respond to one of the questions in the chat that have come up. So on one side, there is the bilateral agreement between the Republic of Peru and the Swiss Confederation that sets the framework conditions around such a cooperation. And separate to that, apart, there are purchase agreements, the contracts between the seller and the buyer of the mitigation outcomes that govern the particular amount in that partnership and the price of the mitigation outcomes. Important to say that the seller and buyer in our approach can be private or public entities, and this may vary from activity to activity under the agreement. So allowing a lot of flexibilities and different possibilities for engagement of different stakeholders. So with this back to the bilateral agreement, what does that in a nutshell do? It sets the legal framework to anchor authorizations of transfers, and it defines all the rules of the game, including, for example, of course, the method for avoiding double counting. And through this clarification and through the legal framework here, the governments or the states provide guarantees to involve stakeholders, and thereby, of course, the investment security is enhanced, and we hope to enable an international carbon market across the two countries. Furthermore, Milagros has spoken to that, the agreement does not specify per se any sectors or type of activities that will be eligible under the agreement. That is very much to be driven through the national frameworks. But it does include a first set of criteria around environmental integrity and sustainable development. And these criteria, yet again, can be complemented and specified further through the national frameworks of the cooperating countries. And finally, of course, some operational rules, procedures to make the cooperation functioning. Very important, we've heard that before also, that certainly it is the intention to adjust the bilateral agreement to multilateral rules as necessary, to of course stay within the framework of the Paris Agreement rules book. And the third piece in the puzzle of bilateral agreement, commercial agreements, are these national frameworks that we've heard of quite a bit already today. At this point, to echo, they make an important puzzle piece in this. The bilateral agreement connects these frameworks, is indispensable in this regard, but many things are being driven through the national frameworks. And I add some more reflection on this on the further slides, but to pick up or to highlight two aspects that certainly are key here is the authorization decision is driven and governed in the national frameworks under the Peruvian Swiss approach. And also the sourcing and development of activities is not formally governed by the bilateral agreement, but very much will rely on national frameworks to identify what are the suitable activities for an Article 6 cooperation. So with this, from our side, some lessons learned. First, on the bilateral agreement side, it, from our perspective, is indispensable to clarify in a legal setting the cooperation conditions that we will engage in. And for us, we found certainly that a strong legal form, so legally binding provisions in this regard, are very important because they reduce risks of all involved stakeholders. On the one side, particularly where private entities invest in mitigation activities. And on the other side, also, of course, for the states involved, so that we can be very sure that there is compliance with the provisions under the Paris Agreement over the entire period of the cooperation. The strong role of the national frameworks in this context, again here highlighted, under the bilateral agreement, the authorization is voluntary. So the decision is uniquely governed in the national frameworks. And this has been chosen for two reasons I would like to highlight. First of all, this allows the national strategy of each country to be built up over time and also to be adjusted over time as we learn in this journey for what a country wants to authorize towards the international carbon market. And it also centers the engagement of a country in its national framework and facilitates, efficient participation also in various international schemes that are likely to be emerging, already today and in the future. So that this is primarily governed and driven through the national debate and discussion. So all this is reflected through various flexibilities built into the bilateral agreement, and that we find important. Again, to highlighted here, the agreement itself allows for various types and sorts of activities of cooperation. We may see, particularly in the early days, niche projects, programs, and then over time, if it is suitable to both sides, may be going further to large-scale sectoral programs at whatever time is appropriate. The agreement allows cooperation for various purposes, so not just for NDC achievement, but for any mitigation objective of public or private entities. And also it allows a direct engagement through the separation of the framework conditions in the bilateral agreement and the commercial contracts between seller and buyer. It allows direct engagement of private actors in the transfers and in cooperation, which yet again should facilitate and the engagement of various stakeholders in the national carbon market. Some lessons learned from our perspective on the national frameworks. We have tried to list on this slide, the steps that needs to be provided for through the national frameworks. We mainly see four. There's authorization, there is some examination of the transfer requirements that needs to be checked by the two governments. We need to keep track of the transfers through a database, registry, and we need to report towards the Paris Agreement. So there is some homework to do in an Article 6 cooperation. Certainly from our experience, the biggest piece is the authorization decision. The other ones I will briefly speak to are, some more homework, but are to some extent, in many cases, underway anyways, or already there in many countries. The authorization decision is certainly something that we have not seen in the pre-Paris Agreement era regarding its scope, what it entails. It includes an entire set of questions, whether a country wants to authorize a specific activity, how this sits towards the NDC so that it is in a positive relationship, to safeguard against overselling, particularly from the host country side, and to check that there's no double counter international climate finance. There's a whole set of questions that is new now under the Paris Agreement era. So this piece, we believe, is the actually biggest task for preparing for the Article 6 cooperation. Particularly or concretely, what we see that needs to be established, even though that often institutional arrangements are in place and need to be mandated to do so, still there is some homework to do. It is to establish that mandate for some governmental entity to take this forward and to take the decisions. And often, probably, there needs to be procedures put in place for interministerial consultation to base such decisions across all relevant involved ministries in the administration. So in the Swiss case, we have a national legislation, the CO2 law, that provides for the mandate, and we do have interministerial committees at technical high level that allow this consultation and exchange that is necessary around such an authorization decision. Also, very probably recommended from our perspective or from our experience is that there is a decision basis established for authorizations. This may be general criteria, it might be a particularly identified list of activities that are eligible for the carbon market or that are exempt, that should not be eligible for the carbon market. It can be a fully fledged or a overall strategy. This may also be built up over time, but certainly such a basis will facilitate this interministerial consultations and provide sound decisions also regarding the authorizations. Again, from our experience, Switzerland will govern that decision basis in national legislation. It is currently in the development, and we have a link there for the particular regulation currently under public consultation and probably in place from 2022. So apart from this, it is a big piece that we need to engage in. And as Milagros was, I think, very rightly saying, this entails an entire national debate that is indispensable to benefit from the international carbon markets. The other elements very much are more, procedures for technical steps, we believe, that are not so demanding to be established. One or two more thoughts regarding the database and registry. From our perspective, in the absence of the issuance of any units, these tools can be very simple. In the Swiss case, from our experience, we will use the national registry that we have already in place from the Kyoto Protocol era, and we will also issue national units for the recognized transfers. However, in the Peruvian-Swiss approach, certainly to date, there is not any issuance foreseen for international units. This is a possible option when there will be demand for this, and if there would be secondary transfers envisaged. That is, however, bound to a definition of a jointly defined and used registry, so we can also secure the tracking and the governance of these established units. The reporting, to finish off this slide, yes, there needs elements to be included in the reports. We believe not so much additional tasks there, as we all will need to report towards the Paris Agreement anyways on a bilateral basis, biannual basis. Sorry. In my last slide, I think we were asked around our first experiences around identification of activities, and would like to take this also in the context of enhanced ambition, which is the spirit of the Article 6. We certainly very much believe that the concrete activities authorized in the end of Article 6 will be decisive for enhancing mitigation ambition. We see Article 6 as an enabler for high barrier climate action. That is where the potential of that international cooperation lies. To grasp this potential of the international carbon market, yet again, it brings me back to the relevance of the national strategies to identify what sort of activities from which sectors, with which technologies will be eligible to source ITMOs. And why I'm saying this, why these strategies seem to be very important to maximize the benefits of each country from the international carbon market. It also seems to us, from our experience, that this does not mean, on the other hand, that we need to wait and first elaborate fully fledged strategies before we start to engage. From our own experience, at least, we have learned a lot from the discussions we had so far with our partners in actually learning for establishing such national strategies. You've seen before the reference to the foreseen regulation currently under consultation. Such regulations in Switzerland are regularly updated. And it is expected that we will, each time we update this regulation, we'll have a much better basis from the lessons learned, and we will elaborate these regulations and criteria that we specify from our side. And we, of course, expect the same to happen on our partner countries' side as well. Regarding the identification of activities, it also will, I guess, depend and vary between countries what role of the private sector is in this journey. On the Swiss side, the acquiring entity of ITMOs and the ones who engage in the commercial contracts is the private sector of Switzerland, and they have a strong role in the identification of these activities. And my very last point on this presentation also in this context to highlight from our perspective the relevance of additionality and safeguarding against overselling from when we identify the activities for Article 6. And these are, I think, issues that are inherently important for both sides, you know, our partner sides, but also our own audience and national debate pays high importance to these aspects. There's probably two areas or three ways that we see how we should respond to get this right, even though that we're still in a steep learning curve on all these aspects. One is certainly already given through Paris Agreement and much reflected in the bilateral approach of Peru and Switzerland, that any activity, any transfer is authorized by both sides. Both governments need to find an activity suitable to go forward. We certainly will pay high importance to providing transparency around in what way this activity is additional and why this has passed this criteria. And also we believe that an emerging common understanding also on the international level, what additionality means under the Paris Agreement era will be very helpful and necessary in the long run. It's all about the credibility of the carbon markets, of what we're doing, that this is beneficial to both sides of the involved parties and also for the global climate. Thank you very much. I hope it is to have responded to some of the questions and looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, thanks, Veronica. If we can stop sharing, thank you very much. Two things I would like to ask. First of all, you know, politely ask people not to promote their own organization and activities, because while I know there may be many potential business partners, I think that this was not the intention of this session. Second thing is, we have a number of questions here that I can go through. However, since we are isolated and not seeing human beings, or unless you happen to live in the same household most of the time, if people would like to raise their hand, I would much prefer to have that as a means of interaction as opposed to me reading questions. So I will promote two people to panelists, and I'll ask them to be relatively quick. So Rosa and Juho Lipponen, if you will, Rosa, would you like to start and introduce yourself, and then we'll move then take two or three questions before we go back to the panelists. So Rosa, do you want to start first, please?
Yes, sure. Can you hear me? I think so now. It's okay. Yeah, my question regarding, it's a little bit, I would like to know why the cooperation is going on between Switzerland and Peru. So why have you come to this agreement? Why have you picked up your, like, reciprocally your different partners? So why Switzerland have chosen Peru, and why Peru have chosen Switzerland? I'm very interested to hear something about that. Yes.
Rosa, do you want to introduce yourself, so at least
oh yeah,
should know?
My name, yeah, I'm based in Oslo. I'm Italian. I finished my PhD on international climate change law, and I work as a lecturer at the Faculty of Law in Oslo.
Thank you, Rosa. And Juho?
Okay, yeah, hello, thank you, Andre. Yeah, and thanks for the two talks, really interesting. I'm Juho Lipponen with the Clean Energy Ministerial CCUS initiative, but don't worry, I'm not going to ask about CCUS. But you spoke to some extent about the role of the private sector in this Swiss-Peruvian deal, and can you say something more about how they have been involved so far? Have they been somehow involved in this sort of design phase, or is it government only? And then who, you know, amongst the economic actors in both countries do you think might be the first movers in doing these deals? Are they already, you know, in your discussions, or is this something that you're going to be looking at, you know, in the next phases? Thanks.
Yeah, Alicia, I'm sorry, I'm not sure that you raised your hand, or I made a mistake in putting you as a panelist. Did you raise your hand, Alicia? maybe not. Maybe it was my mistake. So if you want to take these two comments and questions, go ahead, please. Once Veronica or Milagros, why did you guys choose each other?
Who would not choose Peru?
Best food in the world.
I enjoyed my trips to Lima, certainly. No, I think certainly, you know, our bilateral relations, I would say, are excellent. I think there was a lot of, you know, the level of trust in such early mover engagement is very relevant. And certainly we would say that between Peru and Switzerland, there is this sort of trust that's necessary. Also, we know each other very well and are allied in the UN negotiations around climate change. So we have known each other for quite a while, the intents and motivations and positions of each other, which made, from our perspective, Peru certainly a very preferred partner that we knew we would. It was about finding out how to do it. It was not about negotiating each other. It was very clear from the outset that you're trying to find the best way or sort of a cooperation that benefits both sides the most, while at the same time serving the global climate. That would be my part in answering why this partnership has come up. And also happy to engage on the second question. In the two sort I understand, one in the establishment, designing this cooperation, how the private sector was involved. We certainly had the benefits that we had the CLIC Foundation, which is the foundation from the private sector who will be acquiring ITMOS on the Swiss side, partly also attending the negotiation as part of the Swiss delegation and being in very close exchange, not just with the Swiss side, but also with the Peruvian team in raising any of their requirements for such a cooperation so that this works. And I think this was most helpful to have the private sector highlighting, you know, how this needs to be set up so it actually will work in real life once we have signed such an agreement. And I believe there's a second part to your question on now that the agreement, the legal framework is established, how the private sector or what the experiences are with participation of private sector. So certainly on the Swiss side, there is this, again, private foundation, the CLIC Foundation, that is preparing for acquisition of ITMOS for the NDC of Switzerland. So certainly they are there at the forefront in implementing this agreement. The agreement is also open to be used by any public or private entity to register activities under the agreement and thereby avoid double counting from its activities with the targets of the states under the Paris Agreement. So that is open, that is a possibility, and certainly from the Swiss side and Swiss government is more than open to cooperate, you know, and explore, you know, such engagement with any private entity or public entity for this purpose.
Milagros, do you want to come from your side?
Yeah, I can complement a little from Peru's side. Well, from Rosa's question, I would like to say, and also support what Veronica mentioned. Definitely, the history of the work being done between Switzerland and Peru comes a long way. We have been working with Switzerland, and cooperation with Switzerland is very relevant in Peru, not only on climate change issues, but also on other issues. So that's definitely something to consider because they are a long history partner for the Peruvian government and the Peruvian people in overall. And that's definitely comes to what Veronica mentioned, that that implies that we already knew each other between countries, and that I think is very important because that gives you the trust to start discussing with another country. Also, something that Veronica mentioned, and I would like to highlight as well, is that under the UNFCCC, obviously under the negotiations, we discussed and we knew our standing positions on this process. So that definitely was important, because that implies that we already knew what we were looking at, and that our goals and our process and our views on some of these processes are similar. So definitely that also has helped a lot with this in the agreement process. And I think it was a great question. Thank you for that. Probably nobody asks about that.
Go ahead, please.
And just about on the second question, I would just like to highlight, based on the private sector from Peru's side, I think this is an opportunity. We foresee that this is an opportunity of how also the private sector in Peru can engage, because not necessarily they have been overseeing this climate change process as an opportunity to engage as a sector. So that definitely marks a way, and also can give very important lessons learned about the engagement of different stakeholders in the process. Thank you.
Let me, before I go on, because we've got like 5 people, this is exciting. I mean, actually people are alive. But let me ask you a couple of questions, because I think it's relevant. Again, I know that the Paris Agreement, I mean, do I know that the Paris Agreement rule book has not been finalized? So there's a lot of provisions that are unclear and would need to be dealt. But in terms of the money, there is money that is received in Peru, and the money goes to a private company. I don't know if you saw that far, but you have a deal between Click and somebody else. I don't know, XXX of Lira, and the money goes from one company to the other. So the company gets the money. What happened? Does the state get anything out of it? Is there a royalty? Is there a fund? Is there something like that you're anticipating?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. And I think that the royalty or kind of tribute question is something that's going around in developing countries. How do we, from the different ways in which different stakeholders can engage, how does that also support the governance process in overall of the public sector, right? So definitely that's something that we are that we have encountered, and is part of some of the ideas that have gone through. We do not have a specific decision right now, but definitely that is something that we need to discuss, and that is part of the internal procedures that are also highlighted as part of the agreement. Thank you.
Yeah, because my question comes from the fact that if you export a EDMO, then it's part of your NDC. You're going to have to make it up somehow. So is part of that money going towards that kind of also additional mitigation action? Let me now invite Sergi Quadrat and Augusto Sun to take the floor. So thank you very much for both Juho and Rosa. You're now being demoted. So Sergi, if you want to introduce yourself, and then just tell us who you are, and then Auguste. So let's try and keep it short so we can have a dialogue and be able to listen to as many people as possible. Go ahead, Sergi, please. You are muted, I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Sergi Quadrat. I'm a Chief Operational Officer of Alcott Group. Veronica, this is a small question. Regarding the creation of ITMOS, you're saying that the Article 6.2 approach is not limited to the NDC mitigation pledges. So outside of the NDC, is it possible to create those ITMOS for the Swiss government?
Thank you, Sergi. Auguste?
Hello, everyone. First, thank you for this valuable event. I have been busy with understanding this new decarbonization method, the future of decarbonization way, but I still don't understand how are we going to define the mitigation outcomes. I mean, I might be thinking too much CDM oriented or voluntary carbon oriented. Please forgive me if I'm sticking this traditional way of carbon pricing, but I would like to know what will be the legal nature of the MOs. And in this case, I can't also imagine that there will be some bilateral agreements which will be dictated by Paris Agreement. But as I understood so far, as I considered so far, one carbon unit will be in force, which is called MO. Please correct me if I am also addressing this new concept, this new decarbonization way in a wrong manner. Thank you. Thank you for.
Thank you, August. Look, I think it's a place to put ideas and questions. So anyone wants to pick up? I think the first one was addressed directly to you, Veronica. The other one, who wants to pick it up?
Sure, I can engage on the first question. The agreement between Peru and Switzerland does not govern the question of inside-outside NDC. Well notice though that as well as the Peruvian as well as the Swiss NDC are economy-wide. So it seems certainly that in our instance, anything is from sectors, from activities are relevant for the NDC itself. And certainly also in any case, there will be corresponding adjustment made, independent of the question whether it might even in a theoretical scenario here be outside of the NDC. I hope that responds to the question. And I just give one try to a second question, but Milagros, please. I would say there's a concept of mitigation outcomes. That is, the agreement refers to that if these are not yet internationally transferred. However, these are not governed by the bilateral agreement. The bilateral agreement comes into play with the international transfers, and there's requirements around when this can happen. But the actual concept that is governed is the internationally transfer mitigation outcome that is governed by the agreement.
Is there a point, before I go to Milagros, is there a point, Veronica, so somebody does something in Peru, and reduces, that's a reduction. Is there a point where they become other than the moment they leave the Peruvian registry and goes into Swiss registry, is there another point, an earlier point where they become ITMOs? Like, is there an earlier approval, or this is just simply the point where they leave? Or this is too detailed at this point?
Yes, only once they are transferred internationally. That is the moment of the transfer. When the governments recognize that transfer, they become an ITMO.
Milagros? Thank you, Veronica. Milagros?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, just to follow up on Veronica's question, exactly when there's an authorization letter and the transference, that would become an ITMO. That's primarily the idea. I would just like to highlight that also on some of the questions that put forward, as Veronica mentioned, we are also our NDC is economy-wide. So we need definitely any kind of ITMO we need a corresponding adjustment as part of the process. But to know what could be transferred, and I think also one of the questions, what is the legal nature of this process and the ITMOs, that is definitely being discussed right now in each country. That at some of our neighbor countries have been advancing and progressing on that process as well of defining the legal nature. We are in that process as well, so that definitely will. And that is part of linking this to the national frameworks that, as I mentioned, the mandates come from the Constitution. Thank you very much.
Milagros, can you elaborate a little bit, because you said something, you said a letter of approval. Can you elaborate I think people will I remember when I was in my trading company and I was a policy guy, And I went in there, and these guys were mediocrely interested in all the folkloric stuff that was happening in the COP. They were interested in the mechanics. How do we do it? So what is this letter of approval, and how exactly does it work?
Well, I think that's mainly mostly a letter of approval from both countries, that this is recognized. That's what Veronica also mentioned, that this is part of the agreement, and that will have to be part of the process that we will have to put forward between both countries to authorize this type of activities as part of the framework. How exactly the specific procedure, I don't have a specific answer on that, but I think that there are a lot of lessons learned from the CDM projects and from other projects that can give us a much better input to clarify this process in the near future.
Okay, Stefano, good to see you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Andre, for promoting me. And hi, everyone. This is Stefano from AITA. Thank you for the great discussion so far. Just a quick question. And, we know that Switzerland is also talking to other parties to establish similar agreements, and Peru might also look at different partners in the future and going forward. So I wanted to hear your take on, to what extent you see this agreement and this framework as a blueprint that can just be replicated an X number of times, or to what extent it needs to be tailored to the specific circumstances of each bilateral agreement. Thanks.
And Nadine Planter. Nadine, if you want to introduce yourself very briefly so we know who you are. Okay, Nadine, are you there?
Sorry, yes. Hi, I'm here.
Okay.
Sorry, I was just, I have to be in another meeting, so I was just writing a message.
There you go. Now the truth comes out. Go ahead.
The truth comes out, yes. No, thank you very much for promoting me to panel as well. And my name is Nadine Planzer. I work for Sustain Cert. And my question was twofold. I'm interested about the environmental and the social safeguards that I've seen mentioned. I'm just wondering, because I mean, I guess the international agreement eventually in Article 6, or either the national frameworks, will decide kind of what standards to use and what should be in, what the criteria is. So I'm just wondering if you will, monitor this on top of these national frameworks or international framework, and whether you want to have this validated by a third party, environmental and social safeguards. And also I'm wondering when you'll start piloting. When are you actually going to start piloting the transfers, or I guess the transfers? Thank you.
Thank you. Veronica Milagros, I think there are quite clear questions. Go ahead, please. Milagros, you start this time.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, let me see if I took all the questions correctly. So in overall, definitely, I think that in Peru is open to other type of agreements. The agreement we have signed with Switzerland is not exclusive, and that's part of the process. And I imagine that Veronica will also mention their national processes as well. But in our case, we do not, obviously we don't have exclusivity. So the idea is that we can engage in other processes. Obviously, that will depend on how we further move on this specific process as well. And definitely there are a lot of lessons learned. So I think that will be very good for our country as well. On the question that Nadine mentioned, definitely there are, I would say that there are different types of safeguards and related to both social and environmental safeguards. Internally, we do have a process of safeguards as part of our national procedures. Part of our legislation includes those safeguards, so that's important to clarify. How do we link this to these procedures, or these specific procedures for the implementation of the agreement? That's something that we need to also work on, especially related to institutional arrangements and any other arrangements that will be necessary. But definitely, this is definitely very important for our country, especially related to our national circumstances. As of the piloting of the agreement, I think that first we have to clarify the national procedures in order to move forward to a piloting phase. Thank you.
Veronica.
Thank you. Certainly, we need to find the right setting in each bilateral approach and test how this works for both sides and best suited. So very much echoing Milagros here. We have had the privilege to also, soon after the agreement with Peru, to sign an agreement with Ghana. Now, interestingly, we found, at least from these discussions, that it is a very similar setup. And I think not because the cooperation will look exactly the same, but much more that the agreement, as we've presented between Peru and Switzerland, and equally the one between Switzerland and Ghana, they include a lot of flexibilities and are based on these national frameworks of each country. So that is where the particular circumstances of each countries are being taken into account and will flow into the cooperation. From the very general setup of the bilateral agreement, at least in the case of Ghana, it was found that this is also suitable. What has been elaborated together with Peru, that this also works for the case of Ghana. So that is just the first lesson learned, and we're most interested to find out over the next few years also from other partners whether this is a possible approach or whether there is better ways of approaching Article 6. We will see. Regarding the question around the safeguards, from the Swiss side, in our regulations, we don't foresee to clear or not particular standards, but we set general criteria that we evaluate activities against. So the government will review these authorization requests, the suggested activities. That includes also validation by third parties of the applied methodologies. And the last point here may be important to highlight that the agreement allows to specify any conditions around activity with the authorization statement. Of course, that should also and must include anything that needs to be monitored in the implementation. So we expect that through the authorizations, there will be specific requirements, indicators that need to be monitored, activity specific, in particular regard to sustainable development, environmental integrity.
Veronica, I promoted 3 people, but before we do that, just wanted to ask you, people who buy in Switzerland, there's the Click Foundation, but you refer to the fact that there could be others. I don't know. Whoever, there are lots of trading houses in Geneva these days, or at least there were when I was there, getting involved in the carbon market. Should they buy? Should they reach an agreement with an entity in Peru and buy? What can they do with this stuff? I mean, what is it good for? Is it good to sell to the Swiss state, or they can do something else with it? Okay, they can retire voluntarily, but can they sell it to somebody else? Is this a tradable commodity, or is this something that they buy it and it's for the use of a Swiss government for this NDC? Just for clarity purposes.
The agreement with Peru explicitly clarifies that the ITMOS can be used for any mitigation purpose of any public entity of Switzerland or a private entity domiciled in Switzerland. One very example, which is concrete, is also that the Swiss government has a voluntary climate target, a part of the NDC of Switzerland. So that is already a public entity, the Swiss government, who will be purchasing ITMOS itself. It's at a smaller magnitude than for the NDC achievement. But there goes the first very concrete example that is already underway in preparation. And as said, any private or public entity can decide to register, to authorize through the agreement, and thereby avoid double counting of its offsetting activities to the NDCs of the countries under the Paris Agreement.
But it's only those in Switzerland, and once they hit the Swiss registry, they hit the Swiss registry. They're not going to go anywhere else. At least the agreement between you and Peru is that they stay in the Swiss registry and they're going to be used in some way in Switzerland. They're not to be going to Japan. That doesn't exist at this point. Correct. Okay. Now, yeah, no, just I think that's important to understand, because it's interesting to see how this Article 6.2 mechanism is evolving in the concept of different parties before we finalize. And that is going to also influence, I think, in some way, the stance that people will take in discussions. Sergey, do you want to start? Introduce yourself, please, and let's try and not be too long, because I think that we have another 15 minutes.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I'm from Moscow State University, and my question is actually very similar to what Andrei asked. Well, can Switzerland sell or, account for ITMOs received from Peru to EU ETS? And in general, how do these things correlate? And well, correct me if I'm wrong, well, what is the price of the unit under this bilateral agreement? Thanks.
Thank you. Jorge?
Yes.
If you want to introduce yourself, Jorge, please.
Yes, Jorge Extremadero. I'm from Peru also. I'm now living in Germany. I'm working for Perspectives, a climate consultancy agency. So my question basically was that I can understand that the main objective is to establish a solid framework, but I wanted to know if there are some indicators to be followed or at the end of this agreement to see how well it worked on each country. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
And last, Andreas Pechnik. I hope I pronounced it well, Andreas.
Thank you very much, Andre, for promoting me here on this panel. Thank you, everybody, for this interesting discussion. I'm from a Swiss-based APREN. We are currently developing a project with CLIC in Peru. And I have a question mainly to Milagros, because you were talking about clarifying national regulations before being able to enter completely into the ITMO transfer scheme, which is completely understandable. But as Veronica said also, is there a possibility, before having a fully fledged set of regulations on a national basis, to consider the private-based projects like ours as a pilot that is piloting through this the phase where we have to make the national regulations more concrete or to determine them, in order to promote and refine the same regulations for the future projects. So use piloting projects on the international ITMO basis in order to refine future projects that are under this scheme. Is there a possibility to promote projects in Peru in this manner, considering them as piloting projects to refine the set of regulations on the international and the national basis? Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas. So Milagros and Veronica, I think that there are some specifically addressed to each, but maybe you want to also reflect on others things. So Milagros, please.
Yeah. Thank you for the questions. I would be fast, so I know there's not so much time left. First, on the question related to price, as mentioned, this is not a commercial agreement, so there's no price. The prices will be set in the specific commercial agreements that will be defined. That is not part of the agreement. Definitely, I think that would have made it possibly more difficult to agree, especially because this is a market, right? Thanks also, Jorge, for the question. There are not specific indicators established for the agreement as such. There's no like M&E framework or such, but definitely I think that we will have to that as part of the ongoing cooperation between Switzerland and Peru, there will be some there's a needed way in which to reflect on this process and definitely move forward. And obviously, part of this is also reflecting internally of how we're moving forward in this process that is part of a larger framework. So definitely that is something that we are discussing nowadays. And on the question related, Andreas, related to the pilot, definitely there can be pilot projects, but the idea is how do they link to this overall structure or overall framework. That will be something to discuss because we will need to make the corresponding adjustments and we will need to move also to link this as part of discussing with the sector. So definitely there can be ways in which moving forward, but definitely the recognition and the discussion and all the elements that have been included in the agreement would have that would not necessarily be part of the pilot. So definitely I understand that pilots can bring lessons learned. I totally agree because that's what Peru has also been supporting in different sectors. But we will have to reflect on that. There's no specific, let me say, answer on that right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Milagros. And Veronica, I think there was one specifically addressed to you. The other ones probably not, but nevertheless are interesting questions.
Yeah, I think Milagros covered pretty much all of it. I guess there was just a question of the secondary transfers. Yes, secondary transfers per bilateral agreement are allowed. Of course, it seems in the practical terms to be only viable once units are being issued. Otherwise, this is a bookkeeping marathon exercise. So I would say in the early days, it is set up today as most likely to have a transfer from Peru to a Swiss stakeholder, and that is registered in the national registry in Switzerland. There we will have issuance of units in the national framework, so not leaving the Swiss registry, where you may imagine secondary transfers. But certainly at the international level, first of all, there's this requirement that it's only used by Swiss actors in the bilateral agreement. And secondly, in practical terms, I think this would enter once we have actually issuance of international units, which may be there. There is an option under the agreement, but it's just taking one step at a time and not overcomplicating the first lessons learned, I guess, in this bilateral cooperation.
Thank you very much. I don't see any further hands raised. There's one question in here that I'm not, I don't want to make it particular to Switzerland, but I want to make it more general if you want. I mean, there's a question regarding some, in a very Swiss mode, some loi sur le CO2 of June 13. There seems to be some kind of referendum that a very Swiss thing that very few people understand. But I've lived enough in Switzerland to enjoy all the pancards on the streets. So this is probably, I would imagine, some domestic, Swiss law that somebody likes or doesn't like or wants to repeal or whatever they do. I don't know exactly what they do with it. But once there is a change of law, is there an adjustment to the agreement, or what is the process? But I don't know if you want to address this one specifically. But John Gold is asking the question on the John, I think it's at the University of Geneva, I believe.
Sure. So yes, we are revising the national legislation of Switzerland for the period up until 2030. Parliament has approved that legislation. However, the referendum was taken by the Swiss population. So there will be a public vote. As you say, that is something quite regular in the direct democracy system of Switzerland. The bilateral agreement with Peru is very much based on the Paris Agreement and Switzerland's NDC under the Paris Agreement. So there is of course, it's in the context of the Swiss national legislation. The national legislation defines the roles on the Swiss side on who is acquiring such ITMOs, what requirements there are. It all comes together, puzzle pieces. But the agreement itself is, of course, a self-standing agreement, legal agreement between the two states.
Well, look, thank you very much to both of you and those that have participated. It's a first it's a beginning of our community center and something that we do as a public service, because we think that, we have been involved in Article 6 discussion from when there was no Article 6, and we're strong supporters of this, of international cooperation. We think it's, the CDM, with all its perceived flaws by some, was an incredible boost to this approach of understanding pricing and putting value on nature, on the services of nature, and not taking it for granted. All these were extremely important. So we will continue to do this. We'll continue to look at other ideas, other example, other things that the community per large of people in the Article 6 community will want to listen and be interested. Milagros, Veronica, any last words? We will come back to you as this thing evolves, because it will evolve and there will be new steps, probably not for the next month, but in 6 months or something like that, we'll probably want to come back to you. But any last words from your side?
Yeah, well, first, thanks for the invitation. I know these issues are there. There's always a need or people wanting to know more about the process, and definitely this is an ongoing process. It's a stepwise approach. So we need, and it's new to all of us, right? There are lessons learned, but definitely there are things that we need to continue discussing. So obviously we are, as always, the Peruvian government is open to continue discussions, and we are very happy to also continue discussions with the Swiss government. Thank you very much. Thank you,
Veronica. Switzerland is taken the bull by the horns, and it's not always simple. Nice, Lima is nice to see, but it is nevertheless, it's not something new when you invent something new. So you're obviously to be applauded. Any last thoughts from you?
Just to thank you for this opportunity. Certainly the far we have come so far is by mutual learning from international partners and in a dialogue with the private sector. So any sort of such dialogues, discussions are inherently important. I strongly believe we have come much further on our side than if we would not have engaged in such discussions, particularly with Peru, with the other partners we have. So in this sense, I'm hoping to have many more of such discussions as today. And thank you very much for providing the platform.
Thank you. And we do hope that this is gonna kind of catalyze others, around the world to listen that this is happening, this is possible, and to take the step. Again, thank you, both of you, and to your colleagues and to my colleague, Thomas Mertens, for helping organize this. And we'll hope to see you soon, and hope to see you with a much more advanced stage next time. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.